I learned early on that the deepest kind of love is the one no one ever sees, the kind that's born in silence and held together by daily sacrifices no one ever notices. That's how I lived for years, guarding my own pain so she could have peace, hiding my own falls so she could grow up feeling safe, swallowing my storms so her sky could stay clear, not because I was made of steel, but because I made a promise to myself on the day I held her for the first time. As long as I breathed, nothing would touch her. That promise became the backbone of my life, the foundation that kept me standing even when everything around me tried to knock me down. I walked, carrying fears I never shared, held back tears I never let fall in front of her, and turned my pain into shelter. So before I continue, write in the comments where you're listening from: city, state, country. Because this story crosses borders and reaches anyone who has ever loved so silently that they forgot themselves just to protect someone else. For years, the world believed I was too strong to break, too firm to fall apart, too cold to feel. But no one saw what happened when the lights went out and the noise outside faded. I would sit at the edge of the bed, hold my emotions in both hands, and ask for strength to keep being the structure she needed. There was no space for falling apart, no permission to show weakness, no time to tend to my own wounds. I became the shield she never saw, the silent wall that held back everything that could have harmed her innocence. And that silence, which once was the purest form of love I knew how to offer, eventually became the reason she now looks at me and doesn't understand what really happened. She calls me cold, distant, closed off, having no idea how many times I cried just so she wouldn't have to cry with me. People never understand what a mother does when she decides to love with her whole heart. They don't realize that loving like this means carrying battles on your shoulders that no one ever knew existed. It means swallowing words that would wound, enduring humiliation to protect the innocence of the one you brought into this world, working twice as hard, losing sleep, smiling while your chest is caving in. The love I gave wasn't made of grand gestures. It was made of sacrifices, silent choices, those no one notices, but that change the life of the one you love. And this kind of love, so deep and so rare, is almost always mistaken for coldness, because the one receiving it never sees what you sacrificed to keep them standing. I carried burdens that were never mine, accepted blame that didn't belong to me, and let the world believe I was unbreakable so she could grow trusting she always had someone to run to. I became the rock out of necessity, not nature. I made myself strong because she needed strength. I stayed quiet because she needed silence. I endured because she needed room to breathe. And over the years, I realized my love became so great that it created a space between us, a space she interprets as distance, though it was born from the extreme protection I always offered. I've tried many times to explain to myself why I chose this path, why I preferred to swallow pain rather than share it, why I silenced my own needs so she would never feel fear. And the answer always came the same way, because I loved her with a love too deep to fit into words, a love I wanted to be light for her, even if it was heavy for me. And slowly, I realized this kind of love leaves invisible marks, marks no one sees, but that mold the soul, marks that hold stories that will never be told the same way. The weight of what I lived began to stack up inside me in ways I never imagined. I tried to always be steady, always calm, always the foundation of everything. But the silence I chose to protect her became an invisible wall, a wall she interprets as rejection. And I know I'm not alone. I know many mothers, many women, many people who carry the world on their backs have lived the same feeling of being judged for the very love they offered in the only way they knew how. That's why I want you to stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to share reflects the lives of so many who loved too much and spoke too little. People who hid things no one knows, who carried burdens no one saw, who protected those who have no idea of the price that was paid so they could live in peace. And it was inside that silence that I learned one of motherhood's hardest lessons. Sometimes the one you protect the most is the one who understands your heart the least. Not because they don't love you, but because they never saw what you faced for them. The truth is, when you become someone's shield, that person only sees what the shield keeps them from seeing. They don't witness the battles, they don't feel the blows, they don't know the fears you swallow. They only see peace. And with time, they start believing you're cold because you don't fall apart. They think you're distant because you don't cry. They think you're harsh because you don't show fragility. But the truth is, you only learn to be that way so they would never have to. And as I remember all of this, as I revisit each sacrifice, each silenced wound, each night I hid in the dark to cry, I realize this story isn't just mine. It belongs to so many women who turned pain into love, weakness into strength, silence into protection. Women who carried burdens no one recognized. Women who deserved to be seen but were misunderstood. And that's exactly why this narrative must continue, because there's something else that needs to be said, something that explains the weight I carried, something that reveals why my love was so deep and so silent. There's a part of this story that has never been revealed, and it begins to take shape right where this introduction ends, preparing the way for what I had to face to keep her life at peace. When I think about becoming a mother, it's impossible not to remember the first time I felt that deep fear mixed with a courage I didn't even know I had. It was then, before I ever held her in my arms, that the silent pact inside me began to form. I walked carefully, carrying a life that depended on every move I made, and yet I felt like I was the one learning to depend on something greater. I knew that from that moment forward, nothing would ever be simple again. Nothing would ever be light again. Nothing would remain the same. And still, there was a conviction burning inside me, a certainty that rose above every doubt. I would do whatever it took to ensure she came into this world surrounded by love, even if it cost me pieces of myself no one would ever see. Pregnancy wasn't easy. There were nights when fear consumed me and I had no one to hold my hand. Days when my body felt like it was giving out, and I leaned against the walls, asking God for one more breath, one more ounce of strength, one more step. I spoke to Him in silence, not because I lacked words, but because some prayers are made with the heart, not the mouth. And it was in those silent conversations that I made the deepest promise of my life. As long as I had a voice, she would never hear shouting. As long as I had strength, she would never see me fall. As long as I had faith, she would never feel the weight of the pain I carried. The world could wound me, but I wouldn't let anything touch her purity. The early months were marked by an intense mix of fragility and courage. I remember watching her sleep and feeling a responsibility so great it felt like it pierced through my soul. Every breath she took was a reminder that I couldn't fail. I didn't have the right to fall apart. The love I felt didn't give me rest. It gave me direction, and that direction always led to the same choice: protect. I held my fears, hid my tears, swallowed my worries because I knew that even the smallest crack in me could become a storm inside her. I wanted her to grow up seeing light, even if I had to walk through shadows she would never know existed. Motherhood doesn't just teach you how to love, it teaches you how to give things up. It teaches you that your own desires need to wait, your own dreams need adjusting, your own pain needs rearranging so a small child can bloom without carrying a weight that isn't theirs. There were days when my chest tightened with loneliness, fighting silent battles while everyone around me thought I was whole. But every time I looked at her, something inside me rose again, as if God touched my soul and whispered, "Keep going, because what you're building goes far beyond what the eyes can see." There are moments I'll never forget, like the night I sat on the kitchen floor, exhausted, trembling, yet stood up again when I heard her cry, or the day I had to smile at her while inside I felt like the world was collapsing. These are the kinds of sacrifices no one applauds, but that shape the essence of a mother. Those were the moments when the promise I made to God dug even deeper into my heart. I would repeat to myself with almost sacred determination, "Nothing will touch my daughter. Nothing. Not the weight of my struggles, not the lack of support, not people's judgment, not life's harshness." I would get up as many times as necessary, even if only God saw. Her early years were full of discoveries, but also full of sacrifices she never knew existed. I juggled hard decisions while smiling at her, held overdue bills while rocking her to sleep, carried enormous fears while she played outside, believing the world was safe. And that's exactly how I wanted it to be. Her childhood needed to be light, even if mine wasn't. Her joy needed consistency, even if mine wavered. Her love needed to grow freely, even if mine was always paid in sacrifice. I want you to write in the comments, "I protected, even when it hurt." Because that phrase carries the truth of so many mothers who chose to be strong while they were breaking, who chose to smile while they were exhausted, who chose to love when they barely had strength left for themselves. It's a quiet confession, but a powerful one, uniting every story lived in the dark, far from the eyes of those who received the blessing. I remember the day I realized my daughter had no idea about the size of the monsters I fought for her. Invisible monsters, disguised as financial struggles, failed relationships, sleepless nights, emotional breakdowns I swallowed, with a courage I never knew I had. But that's the role of a shield. It takes the impact so the other person doesn't have to. And I accepted that as my mission. A silent, sacred mission. Over time, I understood that the promise I made at the beginning of motherhood grew inside me like a deep root. It held me through hard days, losses, exhaustion, and the weight of a love that never wanted to wound. And as she grew, I grew too, quietly. I grew as a woman, as a mother, as someone who learned how to turn pain into protection. And this quiet learning shaped not only who I became for her, but who I became for myself. But there's something no one talks about when it comes to this kind of promise. There's a price, a high one. When you choose to carry the world so your child can walk lightly, you slowly give away pieces of yourself, and those pieces disappear without anyone noticing. It's like fading over time, not because you're not valuable, but because love teaches you to put yourself in second place without making it seem unfair. And as I revisit that period of my life, I know the part that was forming inside me still hadn't revealed its deepest truth. And it's exactly that part, the one that started as an innocent promise and became a lifelong mission. That explains why so much happened later. Because becoming a mother wasn't just the beginning of my story as a parent. It was the beginning of a journey that demanded strengths I didn't even know I had. And that is still unfolding. Right where this narrative continues, the sacrifices began so early that when I realized it, they already felt like a natural extension of who I was. I broke quietly so she could remain whole. And even though no one saw, those broken pieces formed the ground where she grew without fear. The truth is that invisible sacrifices are the deepest ones. They don't leave marks on the world, but they leave eternal marks on the soul. There were so many nights when sleep simply wouldn't come, not because I wasn't tired, but because the worries insisted on lying down with me. I could hear her breathing in the next room and knew I needed to stay awake, alert, strong, even when every muscle in my body begged for rest. And while I protected her from the world outside, no one protected me from the storms I faced within. I remember specific nights, so heavy they're impossible to forget. Nights when I would get up slowly so I wouldn't make noise, walk to the bathroom and lock the door just to cry softly, so no one would worry, so my pain wouldn't spill through the walls. I'd sit on the closed toilet seat, hand over my mouth to hold back the sobs, asking only for strength to go on. The cold floor touched my feet and reminded me that I was alone in that moment, but the silence of the house reminded me why I stayed, holding every tear until courage returned. I want those listening to write in the comments, "I cried in silence," because that is the truth for so many of us. That is the pain so many hide. That is the strength so few ever recognize. For years, I juggled everything so nothing would ever be missing for her. I worked any job I could find, took double shifts, smiled at opportunities that came wrapped in humiliation, because I knew that any amount of money coming in could mean one less fear or one more need met. And how many times did I face financial crises so heavy my heart felt like it was beating outside my chest, crises that could have destroyed all the stability I fought so hard to build, but I hid them so well that my daughter never suspected a thing. I remember holding overdue bills in my hand while she danced happily around the living room, unaware that I stood there trying to make numbers add up when they never did. And still, I smiled at her. I always smiled, because her smile was the proof that my effort was worth it. And what about the humiliations? Those I kept as internal scars, Scars no one sees, but that burn every time you remember them. People who spoke, to me, as if I were worth nothing, as if I were too small to deserve respect. Situations where I had to swallow my pride, bow my head, and accept whatever came, not because I lacked dignity, but because I knew that if I reacted, she would be the one to suffer the consequences. I let other people's contempt roll off my skin like cold water, never allowing it to reach her. That's something many mothers do. They endure the world's frost so their children feel only warmth. I broke so many times just to keep her from breaking. I broke when I hid the fear of not having enough. I broke when I stayed silent in the face of injustice. I broke when I had to be strong for 2, for 3, for more than any person should ever have to be. I broke when I found myself alone, carrying everything I never planned to carry. But even in my brokenness, I rebuilt myself. And I rebuilt myself with pieces no one ever saw, with strength I didn't know existed. Today I know it was God holding my edges together. It was Him gathering the parts of me that fell. It was Him shaping my pain into resilience. Because every mother who truly loves learns to turn her own ruins into protection. Sometimes I'd watch my daughter play, laugh, dream, and I'd think, if she knew what I face when she sleeps, she would understand everything. But I didn't want her to know. I didn't want her to grow up with fear, with anxiety, with the feeling that the world was too harsh. I wanted her to have a childhood I never had. I wanted her to have peace, where I only had struggle. I wanted her to feel love, where I only felt absence. And that's why every invisible sacrifice became a way for me to rewrite my own story through hers. I had to learn how to smile when everything inside me was crying. I had to learn how to walk straight when my legs were shaking. I had to learn how to breathe deeply when the world pressed on me. And no one ever knew any of this. No one saw when I gathered spare change to buy something she wanted. No one saw when I skipped meals so she could have the best plate. No one saw when I went to sleep with an empty stomach, but with a full heart because she went to bed fed. Invisible sacrifices have that power. They reaffirm who you are, even if no one recognizes it. There were moments when I was so tired that continuing felt impossible, but all it took was looking at her to understand why I couldn't stop. The love I carried for that child was so great that it gave me strength I didn't have. And, with time, I realized that this kind of love transforms a woman. It shapes, sculpts, strengthens, refines. I stopped being just myself and became shelter. I stopped being just a woman and became a safe harbor. I stopped being just a person and became a foundation. Every tear I held back was a seed of growth. Every silence I swallowed became a lesson that taught me to walk with more wisdom. I want you to write in the comments, I carried it all out of love. That phrase holds not only acknowledgement, but also release. It represents the weight carried by those who endured more than they should and still remained standing. It represents the heart of someone who gave themselves so someone else could have peace. As I revisit all of this, I realize that invisible sacrifices built a bridge between who I was and who I needed to become to care for her. And that bridge supported more than my pain. It supported her future. But as the years passed, those sacrifices began to accumulate inside me, creating a space I didn't notice, a space between what I showed and what I lived, a space between the strong mother she saw and the weary woman I hid. And that space grew, took shape, became silence between us, a silence she would one day interpret in a way I never imagined. And while all of this formed inside me, something even deeper was happening, something I didn't understand at the time, but that I can see clearly now. This accumulation of invisible sacrifices was about to turn into something bigger, something that would explain everything that came after, something that would be revealed at the exact point where this story continues. The weight of silence settled into me so subtly that by the time I noticed, I was already living inside it as if it were my own home. My love was so deep, so full of care, so committed to protecting her, that it ended up becoming absence to someone who never witnessed the origin of that silence. I grew quiet out of necessity, not coldness. I stayed silent because every word I swallowed was a wall I built to protect her from the things I faced. But silence, no matter how noble, began creating a space I never expected to grow so large. I gave everything I had, but to her, it often seemed like I gave too little. I hid myself to sustain her. But to her, I simply appeared distant. And it hurts to realize that the stronger I tried to be, the colder I looked. There came a moment when I understood that if I fell apart, her world would fall apart too. So I learned to pull myself together too quickly. I learned to swallow tears as easily as setting the table. I learned to endure insults and keep cooking dinner as if nothing had happened. I learned to sleep with a heavy chest and wake up with a ready smile. And over time, that automatic survival mode became my language. I was steady, I was consistent, I was present in responsibility, but absent in vulnerability. And that kind of presence is deeply misunderstood because people only see what you show, never what you shield them from by hiding. I never allowed myself to show fragility in front of her, not because I didn't want to, but because I believed it would scare her. I knew that if she saw me crumble, she'd think everything was collapsing. And I never wanted her to carry the weight of my humanity. I never wanted her to worry about me when her only job should have been growing up in peace. So, little by little, silence became my armor, an armor that protected me, protected her, but also separated us. And the more time passed, the more trapped I felt inside that behavior. I wanted to hug her more, but exhaustion weighed on me. I wanted to talk more, but the words wouldn't come. I wanted to explain everything I lived, but she wasn't old enough to understand. And when she finally was, I no longer had the habit of opening up. The truth is, while she grew up, I grew used to silence, and that habit, unintentional, as natural as breathing, turned into distance. A distance that never came from lack of love, but that she interpreted as lack of affection. I want those listening to write in the comments, "My silence carried love," because that phrase carries the truth so many mothers hold in their hearts. A truth rarely spoken, but one that shapes entire lives. Loving in silence is the most painful kind of love, because no one sees the effort you make not to hurt the ones you love. No one sees the words you hold back, the conversations you avoid, the tears you hide. No one notices the strength required not to reveal the world you carry inside. The silence began accumulating between us like a wall built with bricks of good intention. Each brick represented a choice I made for her, a moment when I kept quiet to spare her worry, a moment when I held back emotions to protect her peace, a weakness I hid so she would believe I was unshakable. The wall grew without me realizing it, and when I did, she was already looking at me from a distance, trying to understand who I was behind the fortress I built. To her, I seemed unreachable. To her, I seemed too distant. She only saw the result of my protection, never the reason, and that realization broke something inside me. I could see in her eyes a mix of admiration and hurt, as if she wanted to come closer, but didn't know how, as if she tried to understand my way of loving, but stumbled over the layers I built around my heart. It was painful to see that, in trying to spare her, I was taking away the chance for her to truly know me. She saw me as strong, but never knew the price of that strength. She saw me as firm, but never knew how many times I trembled on the inside. With time, she began questioning my lack of emotional expression, not in direct words, but in gestures, in looks, in silences she mirrored back to me. I could see that she thought I didn't feel, didn't suffer, didn't care. The truth is, I cared so deeply that I hid everything to keep her from being hurt by it. But love, that's too silent, love that sacrifices its own transparency to protect, eventually becomes emotional distance, and that distance grows into misunderstanding, into judgment, into wounds. There were moments when she looked at me as if I were an impossible puzzle. I wanted to say, "My daughter, I am not cold, I am wounded." I became strong because I had to, not because I wanted to. I stayed silent because you needed peace, not because I lacked love. But the words wouldn't come. They stayed lodged in my throat like a knot I couldn't untie. And she interpreted my silence as indifference, when it was actually the deepest form of protection I could give. The weight of that silence grew so heavy that sometimes I didn't even know where I had lost myself inside it. I was the woman who fought for everything but didn't know how to ask for anything. I was the mother who held everything together, but never admitted when she couldn't anymore. And over time, I realized that this habit distanced me not only from my daughter, but also from myself. I no longer knew how to show my pain. I no longer knew how to show my love without feeling too vulnerable. I no longer knew how to break the cycle I created. I want you to write in the comments, silence speaks too, because it does. It speaks of exhaustion. It speaks of love. It speaks of protection. It speaks of stories no one knows. It speaks of everything you held alone so no one else had to. It speaks of internal battles the world will never understand. But at the same time, silence can turn into shadow, into misunderstanding, into distance, just as it did between me and her. As the years went by, my daughter grew up believing I wasn't sensitive, that I wasn't affectionate, that I wasn't open, when in truth, I was all of that, but in ways she never saw. I loved through quiet actions, not grand declarations. I cared through details, not public displays. I showed love through protection, not vulnerability. And still, the absence she felt wasn't real absence. It was only the reflection of love I hid so she wouldn't be wounded by the pain I carried. Love that is too deep becomes absence when there is no space for it to be shown. It becomes a one-way road when only one side understands the reason. It becomes doubt when the recipient doesn't understand the intention. And that's exactly what began to happen between us. My love became shadow, became distance, became silence. She wondered why I was like this. I wondered how to show who I truly was without hurting her. And that quiet tension grew inside me as a constant reminder that I needed to find a way to reconnect what silence had separated. And it is exactly at this point, where hidden love begins to create distance, that something profound starts to move in the story, preparing the ground for what was still to come. The inversion of the story began on an ordinary day, with no warning, no preparation, as if life had decided to turn a mirror toward me and force me to see something I never wanted to face. She was already grown, with her own opinions, her own wounds, her own view of the world. And just when I thought time would finally reveal everything I had hidden to protect her, the opposite happened. She looked at me as if I had never suffered, as if I had walked through life untouched by pain, without scars, without tears, without battles, as if I had been nothing more than a rigid, cold, closed-off figure incapable of feeling. And that look pierced straight through me, like an arrow finding the one unprotected spot on the body. In that moment, I felt the deep shock of realizing that my silence had created interpretations that were never true. Instead of seeing the love I tucked between the lines of my actions, she saw absence. Instead of recognizing the sacrifices I made for her, she saw hardness. Instead of understanding the strength I used to hold her world together, she saw arrogance. And right then, I understood something that hurt more than any sacrifice I had ever made. The person I protected the most was the same person who understood me the least, not because she didn't love me, but because my way of loving was far too silent to be understood without depth. She looked at me with a mix of frustration and questioning, like someone expecting explanations I never learned how to give. I wanted to speak, but my chest locked. I wanted to open my entire story, but the words I hid for years no longer remembered how to come out. I wanted to say that my coldness was never coldness, my distance was never rejection, my seriousness was never lack of love. I wanted to explain that I learned to love by protecting, not exposing, that I grew up without a safe place to fall, so I learned not to fall, that I survived by swallowing pain, so I learned never to let anything spill. But she didn't want apologies. She wanted explanations. Explanations I didn't have, because my whole life was made of instinctive, urgent, necessary decisions. I want those listening to write in the comments, I've been misunderstood too, because that is the mark of every woman who had to protect herself just to protect someone else. Every woman who grew strong because she had no alternative. Every woman judged by the results of her strength while no one ever knew the origin of the pain that shaped her. Our conversation began taking turns I didn't expect. She said I was never affectionate, that I never showed love, that I was never emotionally present, and I listened with my heart tightening, trying to understand how to explain that everything she complained about was exactly what I tried to prevent, her seeing the chaos I carried alone. But to her, my protection became absence, my silence became rejection, my strength became insensitivity, and I couldn't blame her. How could she understand a pain she never saw? How could she recognize a battle she never witnessed? The pain of being misinterpreted is one of the loneliest pains there is, because you hear things about yourself that don't match what you feel, but that make perfect sense from the outside. And when it comes from the person you love more than anything in the world, the impact is devastating. It felt like I spent my entire life holding a roof up so the house wouldn't collapse on her, only to hear in the end that I had never built anything at all. She said I didn't know how to communicate, that I was never vulnerable, never open, never let her into my soul. And in a way, she was. Right, I truly didn't let her in, because if I had, she would have seen pains I never wanted her to carry. She would have seen stories too heavy for a child. She would have felt the insecurity I worked so hard to keep far away from her. I became a fortress so she could be a garden. But she grew up thinking I was made of stone. And that was the moment the inversion of the story became clear. While I believed I was being the mother she needed, she believed she was raised by someone who didn't know how to love. The distance born from protection turned into an emotional wound between us, a wound she interpreted as my failure. And I, who spent my whole life trying to spare her from every hurt, now had to face a new pain born exactly from that effort. There was a moment, while she spoke, when I felt my heart scream inside me. My daughter, you have no idea how many pieces of me were left along the road so you could arrive whole. But I stayed silent, because I knew that for her, this wasn't about truth, it was about perception. And perceptions, once formed in the absence of explanation, become solid as concrete. She asked me why I was so closed off, why I seemed not to feel, why I never opened up, and I realized I didn't have simple answers. How do you explain that you weren't always like this, that life hardened you? How do you tell your child that motherhood found you in fragments, and you had to rebuild yourself in the dark, that you became strong so she could have the right to be fragile whenever she needed? That you became silent because the noise of your pain might have haunted her? I want you to write in the comments, I've been judged without being understood, because that is the reality of so many women who built entire lives quietly, only to be measured by the very parts they hid. With every sentence she said, I relived a piece of the past. I relived nights when I cried in secret. I relived days when I humbled myself just to guarantee the bare minimum. I relived storms I faced alone, and all of it, everything I hid out of love, now turned into reasons for her to believe I was distant, harsh, cold. She believed I had never suffered, that I was an unshakable woman, incapable of feeling what other women feel. And that broke me, not because I wanted her to see my pain, but because she couldn't see my love, a love that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't display itself easily, but that holds everything together. A love she would only truly understand when she finally grasped the cost of the silence I still carry. And it was at that point, in that tense exchange, in that moment when my love and her perception collided, that I felt the story changing direction. Something inside me awakened, as if God were preparing the ground for what would come next. A revelation, a turning point, a moment that would finally show that the suffering she believed I never lived was precisely what held her life together for so many years. And it is from this open wound, from this profound misunderstanding, from this collision between silent love and misinterpreted pain, that the narrative begins moving toward something even deeper, something that will show why this story could never end here. The ghosts of my past began to stir inside me the moment she looked at me as if I had never suffered. It was as if every memory I had carefully buried over the years felt the wind of an old whisper and decided to rise again. I always knew that one day I would have to face these shadows, but I never imagined it would be because of my daughter, the very one I tried to protect from everything that once hurt me. The past I worked so hard to hide began cracking through the silence I built, revealing stories I fought to forget, but that shaped every part of who I became. There are pains we don't choose to remember. They remember us. And that's exactly how it was with every trauma I faced before she was born and after. Abusive relationships that stole my softness, words heavier than bricks, humiliations that left me breathless, emotional violence no one ever saw. All of it marked me deeply, but I never let her see a single trace. I carried the weight of those scars alone because I knew that if she ever saw the depth of my wounds, she would lose the innocence I fought so desperately to protect. I want those listening to write in the comments, I carried it alone, because that is the truth of so many women who hid storms to protect the ones they loved. I.e., remember the first time I realized I was trapped in a relationship that was destroying me little by little. It felt like walking through a minefield, trying to avoid emotional explosions that happened for the smallest reasons. Words laced with poison, screams that shrank me, doors slammed, looks sharp enough to cut. And still, I held myself together because I carried inside me a life that depended on my emotional stability. Every silent blow, every dismissive gesture I swallowed as if it were part of my daily meal, because I believed my pain could not interfere with her peace. And while the world collapsed around me, I cleaned the house, made dinner, put a smile on my face, and pretended everything was fine so she could believe we lived in safety. The truth is, many mothers stay in broken places not because they accept pain, but because they're trying to build stability within chaos. I was one of those women. I was hanging by a thread, yet I made it look like I was whole. I was a cracked house standing out of stubbornness, out of faith, out of love. And every time I crumbled inside, I remembered there was someone watching me, someone who depended on my strength to learn how to walk. So I swallowed the tears, even when they burned like fire in my throat. When I finally managed to leave that environment, I thought the ghosts would stay behind, but they didn't. They followed me. They hid in the corners of my mind, waiting for moments of weakness to remind me of everything I had lived. And these ghosts were not just memories. They were emotional imprints that shaped my behavior, my posture, my silence. They taught me to be guarded, to be rigid, to be closed. They taught me that showing vulnerability could become a weapon against me. And even knowing my daughter would never hurt me, my body had already learned to shut down automatically. There were other losses too, losses I never shared with anyone, losses that tore me apart inside, people I loved who left without warning. Moments when life took from me more than I thought I could bear. There were days when I had to get up and act normal, even after receiving news that could have wiped me out entirely. But she never knew. I hid every sorrow the way someone hides broken glass so a child won't cut their feet. I allowed myself to shatter if it meant she would stay whole. And then there were the fears, old fears, deep fears, rooted fears, fear of failing, fear of repeating history, fear of not being able to protect her, fear of not being enough, fear that the world would hurt her the way it hurt me. These fears guided my choices, shaped my behavior, and influenced the way I raised her. But to her, those fears looked like rigidity, control, distance. She didn't know that every decision I made was the result of a war happening inside me, a silent war, invisible but real. I remember one specific night, one of those when everything seemed to cave in. I was alone, completely alone, holding a pain I didn't know how to explain. I was shaking from head to toe, trying to pull myself together, trying to breathe, trying not to let despair spill over. And in the middle of that emotional collapse, I heard her voice calling me. Small, sleepy, innocent. I wiped my face with my hands, took a deep breath, and walked to her room with my heart still in pieces. She asked for water. I gave it to her. She fell back asleep. I went back to the hallway floor and cried in silence, not letting a single sound escape. That was one of the moments when I realized motherhood demands a superhuman strength, an ability to break and rebuild yourself instantly. I want you to write in the comments, I survived what I never spoke, because that phrase carries the essence of everything I'm revealing here, the essence of the hidden stories so many mothers keep to ensure their children never feel the weight of reality. The traumatic situations I faced didn't happen only before she was born. They kept happening. There were moments when I had to deal with financial losses that felt irreversible, but I never let her sense my despair. There were days when I was emotionally attacked by people who were supposed to support me, but I hid every mark so she wouldn't carry that disappointment. So many times, I had to swallow injustice to avoid conflicts that might affect her in any way, and all of it piled inside me like weight in a suitcase I could never put down. The ghosts I carried were many, and each one taught me to silence myself a little more. They taught me to hide, to protect, to pull back emotionally to avoid new wounds. But this instinctive protection came with a price, and that price showed up in my relationship with my daughter. She only saw the surface, and the surface looked cold. She only saw my posture, and my posture looked rigid. She only saw my silence, and my silence looked like indifference. She never saw the nights when I cried out of fear of not being enough. She never saw the days when I swallowed words so she wouldn't have to carry my heaviness. She never saw the battles I fought while smiling at her. She never saw the monsters I defeated in silence. She never saw how much of myself I wore down just to keep her life intact. And how could she? I did everything to prevent her from seeing that pain. I carried everything alone for one reason: to protect her innocence. And now, as an adult, she looked at me as if I were made of stone, not knowing that in many moments I only kept living because I needed to remain her fortress. The ghosts that followed me through so many years shaped my posture, my ways, my silence. And that silence, which I once believed was an act of love, slowly turned into emotional distance. Not because I wanted it, but because the wounds I hid began building walls around me. And as I returned to these memories, I feel that everything was preparing the stage for something greater. Because those ghosts, no matter how hard I tried to bury them, were about to influence directly what would happen between me and her, leading the story toward a revelation that would change everything. It was at that point in my life when the ghosts of the past felt more alive than ever, and the distance between me and my daughter grew like a silent canyon, that something began to move inside me in a way that didn't come from this earth. It was as if an ancient strength, deep and familiar, the same one that walked with me in the earliest days of motherhood, had decided to speak again. I always knew God had walked with me through every battle I faced, but it was during that period, when the weight of my silence felt like it might crush my chest, that I felt His presence more clearly than ever. It became obvious that He was carrying what I could no longer hold alone, and that awareness didn't come through anything grand or miraculous. It came through quiet, subtle movements, so delicate they could only be recognized by someone who knew how to sense the hand of the divine in the middle of pain. As I remembered the wounds I hid, I realized I hadn't survived any of it on my own strength. In every midnight hour, when I cried softly so she wouldn't hear, there was an invisible comfort wrapping itself around my tired body. In every moment I feared I couldn't continue, a courage appeared out of nowhere, like breath coming straight from heaven. In every difficult decision I made with trembling hands, there was a peace that didn't match the chaos I was living. That was God. God sustaining, God guiding, God holding the pieces of me I thought were shattered forever. I want those listening to write in the comments, "God carried me," because that phrase is truth in the lives of anyone who has walked through storms that felt bigger than their soul could bear. I remember one night in particular, one of the hardest I've ever lived. Everything seemed to fall apart at once. Fear, loneliness, emotional exhaustion, the weight of years of silent battles. It all came crashing down like a violent wave. I was sitting in the dark living room, on the cold floor, my face buried in my hands. I felt empty, drained, exhausted beyond words. And yet, in the middle of that emptiness, something touched me. Not physically, but spiritually. It felt like a soft, steady voice whispered inside me, "I am here." A simple phrase, but it brought more strength than any human embrace could have offered in that moment. It wasn't imagination. I know when God speaks to my spirit. It's a sensation that cannot be explained, only felt. And in that instant, I knew that even if the whole world had turned away, He had not. How many times did I walk into the kitchen with burning eyes, and as I splashed water on my face, it felt like God was using it to calm my soul? How many times, as I folded clothes or picked up toys, did a sudden, inexplicable strength fill my chest, as if He were saying I wasn't alone in the daily exhaustion? How many times did I want to quit from so much responsibility, so much pressure, so much hidden pain, but a courage I never asked for somehow lifted me to take another step. That courage was God whispering, "Keep going. I am sustaining you." I know many women listening right now have felt this too. That moment when you simply cannot bear anymore, but you continue anyway. That moment when your soul aches, but a faint light still pushes you toward one more day. Write in the comments, God was with me when no one else was. This isn't just a comment. It is a spiritual memory awakening inside anyone who has lived the silent pain of motherhood, loneliness, or hidden battles. What amazes me most is that even while carrying my own traumas, I never stopped feeling God beside me. When people called me cold, when they judged me, when they dismissed the pain I hid, He knew everything. He saw every tear that fell on my pillow, every prayer whispered through trembling breath, every desperate plea for strength, so I wouldn't let my sorrow spill where my daughter could see it. God knew my intention, my love, my fight, and even when she didn't see it, He did. Even when she interpreted my silence as indifference, God knew the deep roots behind it. He knew that what looked like coldness was actually the last wall holding me together, and that is why I never felt truly abandoned. People can misjudge us, leave us, misunderstand us, but God never mistakes who we are. He reads the heart, not the surface. He understands the truth behind the words we didn't say, behind the smiles we forced, behind the strength we pretended to have when we were too tired to exist. He knows our pain even when we choose to hide it from everyone else. There were moments when I felt God holding my face when I couldn't lift my head. Moments when He gave me answers I didn't know I needed. Moments when He sent small, meaningful signs, discreet but powerful, guiding me through the darkness. He gave me dreams that strengthened me, placed people in my path, whose words reached exactly the wounds I hid. He placed inside me a strength I would have never discovered on my own. And even though my daughter didn't know any of it, God knew. He reminded me, day after day, that no sacrifice made in love is ever wasted. I want you to write in the comments, God saw my sacrifice, because that phrase acknowledges what no one else saw, what no one applauded, what no one valued. God saw, God honored, God recorded every gesture. There are things only God can understand. Why a mother falls silent, why a woman closes herself off, why someone who loved so intensely appears so hard. He understands because He knows the entire path, not just the current chapter. He saw the young girl who was afraid. He saw the young woman whose heart was broken. He saw the mother who fought to protect her child. He saw the weary warrior who still stood firm. He always saw. And it was within this spiritual movement, quiet yet powerful, that I realized nothing I lived was meaningless. Every hidden tear was a seed. Every silent pain was a step upward. Every secret battle was preparation. God was shaping in me not just a mother, but a woman capable of walking through storms without losing herself. He was preparing me for the day when the truth would need to be placed before my daughter, for the day she would finally see not the coldness she imagined, but the strength that kept me alive. Because even when she couldn't see it yet, God was preparing her eyes for the future, a future where she would understand the depth of my love, a future where He would reveal everything the silence hid. And the more I felt His presence wrapping around me, the more I understood that the story had not yet reached its turning point. Something greater was being woven behind the scenes, something that would completely transform how she saw me, something that would reveal clearly that not a single sacrifice had been forgotten by God. The revelation didn't come like thunder, or like a sudden flash tearing the sky. It came in God's timing, never early, never late. And when it finally began, I realized that every silence I endured, every pain I hid, every battle I fought alone had been preparing the ground for this moment. I didn't know how it would happen. Through someone, a difficult situation, an unexpected event, or a soft word. But I knew it would come. I carried that certainty like an old promise written not on paper, but on my soul, because I always believed that one day my daughter would understand who I truly had been for her. The shift began subtly, almost invisibly. She walked differently, observed more, questioned less, and when she looked at me, she seemed to search for something beyond the surface she had created for years. It was as if her heart were undergoing a quiet awakening, one that no human explanation could force, only God could initiate. And in the beginning of that awakening, I felt something inside me tremble, not from fear, but from recognition. The revelation was beginning. There was one day that marked this shift deeply. She came home quieter than usual, eyes distant, as if she had witnessed something that made her rethink her entire life. I sensed something had happened, but I didn't ask. Life had already taught me that some truths must ripen inside the heart before being spoken aloud. She set her bag on the couch, sat at the table, and stared at her hands. The silence in the room wasn't cold, not heavy. It was a silence, announcing reflection. After several long minutes, she took a breath and told me she had seen something that unsettled her. A mother, alone, trying to soothe her child while handling devastating news. She described how the woman tried to smile despite the agony in her eyes, how she swallowed her pain so the child wouldn't be frightened, how she carried her anguish with the ease of someone who does it every single day. And as she spoke, her voice began to falter. She didn't look at me, but I knew. Her story wasn't really about that woman. It was about me. For the first time, she was seeing a reality that had shaped our entire life, the silent strength I always needed to have. When she finally lifted her eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not guilt, not regret, recognition. A small seed, but real. And it began sprouting right then. She didn't say anything about me directly, but she didn't have to. Her eyes spoke. She was beginning to understand. I want those listening to write in the comments, I recognize the truth. Because recognition is a cure that begins from the inside out. Slow, but transformative. As the days passed, I noticed she began paying attention to my gestures, my ways, my silence. Things she once misinterpreted as coldness now seemed to make sense. When I was quiet, she no longer saw indifference. She saw respect for my own limits. When I made firm decisions, she no longer saw harshness. She saw responsibility. When I didn't show vulnerability, she no longer saw lack of emotion. She saw the strength I had been forced to build to survive. Revelation continued. One afternoon, while we were sorting through some old boxes, she found a container I had avoided opening for years. Inside were letters I never sent, records of difficult times, pictures from days when I smiled on the outside, but carried deep sorrow within. She picked up one letter and read it silently. I knew which one it was. I had written it to myself during one of the darkest moments of my life, promising that my daughter would never carry the scars that marked me. When she finished reading it, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't ask a thing. She simply moved closer, as if that silent gesture was a request for forgiveness. That was when I understood God was revealing everything at the right time. Not through confrontation, not through arguments, not through long explanations, but through life itself, through awareness, through His gentle touch. The revelation wasn't about excusing my mistakes or justifying the way I raised her. It was about revealing the purpose behind each silence, each choice, each step. There were moments when she came to talk, and even without knowing exactly how to phrase her thoughts, every word showed she was beginning to connect the dots. She asked about my past, gently, not to judge, but to understand. She asked about my youth, my struggles, my decisions, and I answered only what was needed, not turning anything into drama, but not hiding anymore either. She was ready to hear, and I was ready to allow her in. I want those listening to comment. One day, they'll understand my story. Because that is the silent hope of countless people who gave everything in silence and were misunderstood. The truth always arrives, sometimes late, but it arrives. The revelation took full shape when she faced, for the first time, an emotional weight that required her to be strong. I watched her trying to hold everything together alone, trying not to burden anyone, trying to hide her pain from the people she loved. And when she finally broke, she realized that hiding suffering isn't coldness, it's protection. That moment hit her like a mirror. She called me late that night and said a simple phrase that carried everything I had longed to hear. Now, I understand. I closed my eyes, not to cry, but to give thanks. It wasn't my victory. It was God's timing. But the revelation wasn't fully complete. The deepest part came days later when she came to my home, walked in slowly, sat across from me, and said that for years she believed my silence was lack of love, when, in truth, it was love in its rawest form. She said she now understood that I was firm because I couldn't afford to be fragile, that I stayed quiet because I couldn't afford to overflow, that I hid my pain because she wasn't meant to carry weights that didn't belong to her. I listened with a still heart, grateful and unhurried, because I knew this wasn't just a conversation. It was healing. It was God revealing the unseen. It was Him opening her eyes to what my gestures had never been able to express. And as she spoke, I realized something much bigger than the two of us was unfolding. It was as if God were stitching back together, with invisible thread, all the pieces that had drifted apart throughout the years, as if He were restoring truth to its rightful place, revealing the love behind the silence, the courage behind the coldness, the intention behind the distance. And still, I knew this revelation was guiding our story toward an even deeper place, something God had prepared long before, something that would explain every tear I hid and every pain I carried in silence. Silent love is still love, even when the world tries to distort it, even when the one who receives it doesn't understand the price that was paid. The truth is, there is a kind of love that makes no noise, that asks for no recognition, that seeks no applause. It shows itself through restrained gestures, hidden tears, uncelebrated strength, and invisible sacrifice. And it was that love that sustained my entire journey as a mother. Not perfect love, not beautifully spoken love, but sacrificial love. The kind that chooses to protect even when it hurts. The kind that stays quiet so it won't wound. The kind that stands firm so the one under its protection doesn't break. With time, I learned that this kind of love doesn't need to be understood to be real. It exists because it comes from a deep place, a place only God sees. He knows every time I chose silence not out of coldness, but out of care. Every time I swallowed my pain to preserve her peace. Every time I fought my own ghosts so she could have a future untouched by mine. God saw every choice, every tear, every sacrifice. Even when no one else did, He did. And that is enough. Life tried to hide my worth behind my silence, tried to twist my strength, make it look like hardness, tried to turn my protection into distance. But God honors what the world tries to erase. He takes the story that was misunderstood and restores its meaning at the right time. He transforms what looked like coldness into wisdom. He reveals what was hidden beneath pain. He elevates what was lived sincerely, even in secret. Today, when I look back at everything I lived, I understand that the love I gave was never small. It was simply quiet. And quiet love isn't lesser love. It's deeper. It holds. It saves. It remains, even when it's not understood. And if there is one truth I carry peacefully, it's this. God honors this kind of heart. He restores. He reframes. He reveals. And He gives back in peace everything we once gave in pain. Now write in the comments, "My love has value," because that truth must be spoken, affirmed, honored. Many stories were lived silently, but that doesn't make them any less extraordinary. And before you go, I want to invite you to continue this moment of reflection and strength. Another video from the Matriarch Secrets is appearing on your screen. A new story, separate from this one, but filled with the same depth, the same wisdom, the same transformative essence. Let the next narrative touch your heart with the same intensity. Click on the video beside this one and continue this journey of revelation and healing that you know, deep down, you deserve.